My parents called me a useless failure and threw me out into a freezing storm. Go live in the streets, my father yelled, hurling my bag into the mud. They had no idea I was quietly earning $15 million a year, so I just smiled, walked out into the rain, and prepared to buy the very ground they stood on. 5 weeks later, they lost absolutely everything. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. My name is Tessa, and I am 33 years old. On a Friday evening during one of the worst torrential downpours Austin, Texas had seen in a decade, my own father threw me out of my childhood home. The rain was lashing against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand foyer, creating a deafening roar that almost masked the sound of his screaming. Almost, but not quite. "You are a useless failure. Go live in the streets for all I care." My father Harrison stood over me, his face purple with rage. His designer suit was perfectly pressed, a stark contrast to the sheer ugliness of his behavior. He grabbed my scuffed, faded duffel bag from the imported Italian marble floor and hurled it out the open front door. I watched it land with a heavy, wet thud in the freezing mud of their pristine front lawn. The rain immediately began to soak through the cheap fabric, ruining the few plain clothes I had packed for this trip. I had only been staying in their guest room for exactly 3 days. I had flown back to Texas under the guise of wanting to reconnect, driving a beat-up compact rental car and wearing clothes I had deliberately bought from a discount store. I wanted to see them clearly, to test the waters and see if 5 years of distance had changed them. 5 years ago, I was a struggling 28-year-old who had just watched her first tech startup collapse. I had gone bankrupt, lost everything, and begged my parents for help. They had turned me away, then calling me an embarrassment to the family name and a poor investment. When my first startup failed, I spent nights crying on the floor of a tiny studio apartment, wondering how I would buy groceries. I had called my father, swallowing every ounce of my pride, asking for a small loan just to keep my electricity on. He had laughed on the phone, telling me that the real world does not reward participation trophies, and hung up. I survived on cheap noodles and tap water for months. I taught myself new programming languages at the public library because I could not afford internet access. Every single line of code I wrote was fueled by the desperation of survival and the burning sting of their rejection. I built my empire in absolute silence, away from their judging eyes and constant criticism. I had returned this week hoping to find a family that had missed their daughter. Instead, I found the exact same ruthless people I had left behind. The explosive argument currently echoing through the cavernous foyer had started over dinner, all because I refused a simple request from my older brother Cameron. At 35 years old, Cameron was the undisputed golden child of our family. He was tall, traditionally handsome, and possessed the kind of arrogant charisma that charmed investors and blinded our parents to his profound incompetence. Cameron ran a supply chain logistics company that our father had practically bought for him. He loved to parade his title of chief executive officer at country club gatherings, always making sure everyone knew he was the successful child. But tonight, over roasted duck and expensive wine, the golden boy had looked desperate. He had cornered me before dessert was even served. He demanded that I sign over the rights to a piece of software code I had been casually working on during my stay. He called it my worthless little app code. According to Cameron, his company was experiencing some minor technical hiccups, and my code could serve as a temporary patch to fix his routing systems. He did not ask for it politely. He demanded it. He framed it as a family tax, a way for me to finally make myself useful and repay our parents for allowing me to sleep in their guest room for 3 days. Cameron did not even understand the code he was demanding. He threw around buzzwords like optimization and algorithmic efficiency, clearly parroting something his own frustrated IT department had told him. He was losing clients because his logistics software was outdated, causing massive delivery delays and lost revenue. His desperation was palpable, hidden poorly beneath his custom-tailored suit and expensive cologne. He thought he could bully his younger sister into handing over her intellectual property for free, completely blind to the irony that the so-called failure was the only one holding the lifeline his failing business desperately needed. I knew exactly what his company did, and I knew that my code was far from a worthless little app. It was a highly sophisticated routing algorithm that could save a logistics company millions of dollars in operational costs. It was the exact algorithm that powered the business-to-business tech giant I had secretly built over the last 5 years. But Cameron did not know that. He just saw a younger sister he could bully into doing free labor to cover up his own corporate failings. When I calmly told him no, that the code belonged to me and I was not giving it away, the entire house erupted. "How dare you refuse your brother?" My father had roared, slamming his fist onto the dining table so hard, the crystal wine glasses rattled and spilled dark red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. "After everything we have done for you, after opening our home to you again, when you have clearly made nothing of your life, you have the audacity to be selfish." I had looked at my father, taking in his furious expression and the absolute lack of respect in his eyes. I kept my voice steady and asked him why Cameron could not just hire his own software developers if his logistics company was doing as well as they constantly bragged it was. I asked why a supposedly thriving enterprise needed to steal code from a bankrupt sister. That question was the match that lit the powder keg. Cameron had gone pale, then bright red. He pushed his chair back violently, the wood scraping harshly against the floor. He accused me of being a jealous, spiteful failure who wanted to sabotage his success out of pure envy. He loomed over me, pointing a shaking finger toward my face. "You are bankrupt, Tessa. You drive a car that belongs in a junkyard. You wear cheap rags. I am offering to take your garbage code and actually put it to use in a real multi-million-dollar company. You should be thanking me on your knees for even looking at your work." I did not tell them the truth. I did not defend my bank account or explain my success. I simply stood up from the table, walked upstairs to the guest room, and packed my scuffed duffel bag. I knew then that no amount of money or success would ever make them love me. They only valued what they could control, and because they thought I was weak and destitute, they felt completely justified in treating me like a stray dog they regretted feeding. Which brought us back to the front door, standing in the cold air blowing in from the Texas storm. The wind howled through the entryway, blowing rain onto the expensive Persian rug. I stood there letting the chill wash over me, feeling an incredible sense of clarity. For 5 years, a small wounded part of me had wondered if I was the problem. I had wondered if my father's harshness was just his way of pushing me to succeed, if my brother's arrogance was just typical sibling rivalry that I was taking too personally. But looking at my father now, seeing the pure, unadulterated contempt in his eyes as he pointed toward the dark, flooded street, I knew the absolute truth. They did not love me. They only loved the power they held over me. And since they believed I had nothing left to give, I was garbage to be thrown out into the storm. "Get out of my house," my father yelled one last time, his voice hoarse from screaming. "And do not ever come back here begging for handouts. You are entirely on your own." I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me. I looked past him to the dining room where my brother was probably already pouring himself another glass of wine, celebrating his perceived victory over his useless sister. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or beg them to reconsider. The years of desperate crying and seeking their approval had died a long time ago. Instead, I looked my father right in the eyes and smiled. It was a calm, steady smile that seemed to unnerve him for a fraction of a second. I stepped over the threshold, walking directly into the freezing rain. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind me with a resounding thud, locking me out of my childhood home forever. I walked down the long, manicured driveway, my cheap shoes sinking into the mud where my duffel bag lay ruined. I did not bother picking it up. There was nothing in that bag I actually needed anymore. I just kept walking, letting the rain wash away the last lingering attachments I had to the people inside that house. They thought they had just discarded a burden. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who had the power, the money, and the absolute determination to dismantle their entire world. I walked exactly 2 blocks. The neighborhood streetlights flickered in the storm, casting long shadows across the pavement. At the corner of the avenue, idling quietly under the glow of a street lamp, sat a massive blacked-out Mercedes Maybach. The rain sheeted off its pristine, polished exterior. As I approached the vehicle, the rear passenger door swung open smoothly. The warm, leather-scented air from the cabin spilled out into the freezing night. I stepped inside, sinking into the plush heated leather seats, and the door pulled shut automatically, completely silencing the roar of the storm outside. "Rough night," a voice asked from the seat across from me. My business partner Felix was sitting comfortably in the ambient lighting of the luxury cabin. He was impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, looking completely unfazed by the weather raging outside. He reached into a hidden compartment and handed me a thick, heated microfiber towel. "Just family bonding," I replied, taking the towel and drying my soaking hair. "They told me to go live in the streets. Cameron assured me I would be begging him for money by Tuesday." Felix let out a low, amused chuckle. He tapped the screen of the sleek iPad resting on his lap, begging him for money. That is incredibly ironic considering what I have been reviewing for the last 45 minutes. I shed my wet jacket, tossing it onto the floorboard. The cheap fabric had served its purpose perfectly. It had convinced my family that I was still exactly who they wanted me to be, a helpless, broken failure. They needed me to be a failure so they could feel superior. They needed me to be poor so they could wield their wealth like a weapon against me. "What do we have, Felix?" I asked, leaning back into the heated massage seat. Felix adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the digital document in front of him. "I pulled the quarterly revenue reports while you were inside playing the prodigal daughter. The routing algorithm you just deployed to our European logistics partners has exceeded all performance metrics. We are currently sitting at a verified $15 million in annual recurring revenue, and that is a conservative estimate. If the Asian market expansion holds its current trajectory, we will easily clear 20 million by the end of the fiscal year." I nodded slowly, letting the numbers wash over me. $15 million a year. 5 years ago, I had begged my father for $3,000 to cover my rent and servers so I could keep my first company afloat. He had called me a poor investment and shut the door in my face. I had taken that rejection and channeled it into building Apex Holdings, a business-to-business tech empire that operated entirely behind the scenes, optimizing supply chains for some of the biggest corporations on the planet. I was the sole founder. Felix was my trusted right hand, the man who handled the public-facing corporate negotiations, while I wrote the code and directed the strategy from the shadows. My family had absolutely no idea that Apex Holdings existed, let alone that I owned it. "Well," I said, adjusting the cuffs of my damp shirt, "I guess I will not need to beg Cameron for that motel money after all." "No, you will not," Felix replied, his tone shifting from amused to sharply professional. "But Cameron might be begging you." I paused, looking across the luxurious cabin. "Explain." Felix turned the iPad around and handed it to me. The screen displayed a highly confidential pitch deck. The logo at the top of the title slide belonged to Vanguard Logistics, Cameron's precious supply chain company. The very company my father had funded, the company that made Cameron the undisputed golden child of our family. "They just submitted this to our acquisitions department an hour ago," Felix explained, his voice perfectly even. "It was sent directly to the anonymous corporate inbox for Apex Holdings. They are pitching a desperate expedited buyout." I stared at the screen, my heart beating a steady rhythmic drum against my ribs. I swiped through the slides. Cameron was asking for $30 million. The pitch was filled with aggressive projections, inflated market shares, and grandiose claims about Vanguard Logistics dominating the regional supply chain sector. But underneath the flashy graphics and bold corporate speak, the desperation was glaringly obvious. "Why are they pitching a buyout?" I asked, my eyes scanning the executive summary. Cameron just spent all of dinner bragging about how Vanguard was practically printing money. He acted like he was the king of the industry. Felix leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because he is drowning, Tessa. Our preliminary market analysis shows that Vanguard Logistics is hemorrhaging clients. Their routing software is obsolete. They are missing delivery windows, burning through fuel budgets, and facing massive penalty fees from their largest retail partners. The technical hiccups he mentioned to you tonight are not hiccups. They are systemic, catastrophic failures in his entire operational infrastructure. He needs cash, and he needs it immediately, or Vanguard is going to fold before the end of the quarter." I looked down at the iPad in my hands. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Cameron had physically shoved me out into a freezing storm, demanding I hand over my worthless little app code for free to fix his broken company. He had mocked my clothes, mocked my bank account, and told me I was dead to the family. And all the while, he was actively begging my anonymous holding company to buy him out and save him from absolute ruin. Hi is asking for 30 million, I said, tracing the number on the digital screen. Is the company even worth a fraction of that? Not even close, Felix scoffed. They are inflating their asset valuations to make the deal look sweet. Without a massive overhaul of their core technology, Vanguard Logistics is basically a sinking ship filled with depreciating trucks and angry contracts. He is looking for a billionaire savior to bail him out before the market realizes he is a fraud. I sat back in the leather seat staring out the tinted window at the rain-battered streets of my former neighborhood. My parents believed Cameron was a genius. They believed he was building a legacy that would cement our family name in the upper echelons of Texas high society. They had thrown me out like garbage to protect his ego. They had no idea that the billionaire savior Cameron was actively begging for was currently sitting 2 blocks away, wiping the mud off her shoes in the back of a Maybach. What is our standard protocol for cold pitches like this? I asked, my voice deadly calm. Usually we reject them outright, Felix replied, taking the iPad back. We do not buy failing regional companies unless there is a strategic geographical asset we need. I can have the legal team send a standard rejection letter by Monday morning. It will crush him, but it is standard business. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, picturing my father throwing my bag into the mud. I pictured my mother sneering from the staircase, calling me a drain on their legacy. I pictured Cameron laughing as he locked the door, leaving me in the storm. No, I said, opening my eyes. Do not reject it. Felix raised an eyebrow. You want to entertain a $30 million pitch from a failing company run by the brother who just threw you out into the rain? I want to engage, I corrected him. I want you to reply to Vanguard Logistics from the official Apex Holdings executive account. Tell them the CEO is intrigued by their regional footprint and is willing to open preliminary buyout negotiations. Felix studied my face, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his features. He knew exactly what I was doing. You want to buy your brother's company. I do not want to buy it to save it, Felix. I want to buy it so I can own it. I want to control the very legacy my mother cares so much about. They think I am a useless failure who cannot afford a motel room. They think Cameron is an untouchable genius. It is time we let them prove exactly how smart they really are. Felix tapped the screen of his iPad, already drafting the email to Cameron's corporate team. Consider the bait dropped. How do you want to play the negotiations? I looked down at my damp, cheap clothes, contrasting sharply with the pristine luxury of the vehicle around me. We play it entirely by proxy. I remain the anonymous CEO of Apex Holdings. You are the face of the acquisition. Push Cameron hard. Demand full transparency. Make him sweat for every single dollar he is asking for. If Vanguard Logistics is truly bleeding out, there will be blood in their financial records. I want to know exactly how deep his failures run before I buy the ground out from under him. Felix nodded, his fingers flying across the digital keyboard. The preliminary interest email has been sent. Your brother will find it in his inbox on Monday morning. He is going to think he just won the lottery. Let him think he won, I said softly, turning my gaze back to the dark, stormy night outside the window. Let him celebrate. Let my parents throw him a parade for securing a corporate buyout. The higher they climb on their pedestal of arrogance, the harder they are going to fall when I finally pull the rug out from under them. Drive, Felix instructed the chauffeur. Take us back to the penthouse. It is time to get to work. The Maybach glided smoothly away from the curb, leaving my childhood neighborhood behind in the darkness. My family had demanded I go live in the streets. They had no idea that by Tuesday I would begin the meticulous, ruthless process of buying their entire world. Monday morning arrived with a blinding sunrise over the Austin skyline. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown penthouse, holding a cup of black coffee. The storm from Friday night had completely passed, leaving the city washed clean and glistening under the Texas sun. My residence occupied the entire top floor of one of the most secure luxury high-rises in the financial district. It was a fortress of glass and steel, a quiet sanctuary miles away from the suburban nightmare my parents called home. Downstairs, private security guarded the lobby 24 hours a day. Up here, I was untouchable. I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked down at my phone resting on the marble kitchen island. It had been vibrating incessantly since 6 in the morning. The screen lit up every few seconds with a new notification, a new text message, a new missed call. Anyone else might have assumed my family had spent the weekend cooling off, that the barrage of messages was a chorus of apologies for throwing me out into a freezing downpour. I knew better. My family did not do apologies, they did public relations. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. The notifications were not checking to see if I had found a safe place to sleep or if I had caught a cold from walking in the rain. It was an orchestrated, vicious campaign of harassment designed to punish me for daring to say no to the golden boy. Cameron had clearly spent his weekend spinning a narrative that painted him as a benevolent savior and me as an unhinged, ungrateful parasite. I opened my email first. My personal inbox was flooded with messages from extended family members I had not spoken to in years. Aunt Patricia had sent a 3-paragraph essay at 7 in the morning. I read the words with a detached sense of amusement. She told me I was a disgrace to the family name. She accused me of being a lazy, entitled brat who had completely disrespected my parents after they had graciously opened their home to me. According to her, my mother was beside herself with grief over my selfish behavior, and my father's blood pressure was dangerously high because of the stress I had caused. My cousin David, who still lived in our parents' basement at 30 years old, sent a series of aggressive text messages calling me a toxic drain on society. He said I should be on my knees thanking Cameron for even speaking to me, let alone offering to include me in his business ventures. The sheer hypocrisy of the flying monkeys rushing to defend Cameron was staggering. They had only heard one side of the story, a highly edited, completely fabricated version of events, where my refusal to work for free was twisted into an act of malicious sabotage. But the real masterpiece of manipulation was waiting for me on social media. I opened the professional networking app. Cameron loved treating it like his own personal stage, where he could play the role of the visionary young executive for his peers and investors. Right at the top of my feed was a post he had published late Sunday night. It already had hundreds of likes and supportive comments from his country club friends and corporate cronies. The post was a masterclass in passive-aggressive victimhood. He had written a lengthy, dramatic essay about the burdens of leadership and the heartbreaking reality of having to cut toxic, lazy family members out of your life to protect your peace. He wrote about how hard it is to build a legacy when the people closest to you are trying to drag you down with their negativity and lack of ambition. He claimed that true success requires making difficult choices, like walking away from people who refuse to help themselves. He did not mention me by name, but he did not have to. He had subtly tagged my old inactive profile at the very bottom of the post, ensuring that anyone who clicked on it would see my outdated information from my failed startup days. He was publicly shaming me to his entire professional network, using my perceived failure to elevate his own status. I scrolled down to read the comments. My father had replied with a touching message about how proud he was of his son for standing strong in the face of family adversity. My mother had chimed in saying that true leaders have to make hard sacrifices, and that Cameron was a shining example of integrity. Their friends praised him for his bravery and emotional intelligence. I swiped over to another social platform, and it was the exact same story, just tailored for a different audience. Here, the post was accompanied by a staged photo of Cameron and my parents, looking solemnly at the camera, standing in the very same foyer where they had violently shoved me out the door. The caption read, "Family is not always blood. Sometimes blood is just a biological accident. Guard your energy against those who only take and never give." I set the phone back down on the cold marble island. The audacity was almost breathtaking. They had physically assaulted me, locked me out in a storm, and told me to live in the streets. Yet they had somehow convinced themselves and their entire social circle that they were the victims of my cruelty. They were controlling the narrative, framing me as the villain before I even had a chance to speak. But what they did not understand was that I had no intention of speaking. I had no desire to jump into the comment section and defend my honor. I did not need to convince Aunt Patricia or Cousin David that I was a good person. Engaging with them would only validate their drama and give them the attention they were so desperately craving. They wanted a fight. They wanted me to call them crying, begging them to take down the posts, begging for their forgiveness, so I could be welcomed back into the fold. I walked over to the espresso machine and poured myself a second cup of coffee. The rich, dark scent filled the pristine kitchen. I felt a profound sense of peace settling over me. Let them post their lies, I thought. Let them gather their sympathy and bask in the glow of their fake victimhood. Let them paint me as the penniless dropout who ruined their weekend. They were building a massive, fragile house of cards, and they had absolutely no idea that a hurricane was already heading straight for them. My phone buzzed again, breaking the silence of the penthouse. This time it was a secure line ringing. The caller ID displayed Felix's name. I picked it up, leaning against the counter. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Good morning," Felix replied. His tone was brisk, all business. "I assume you have seen the circus your brother is orchestrating online this morning." I confirmed. He is currently playing the martyred CEO online and the heartbroken son for his friends. The extended family is acting exactly as expected. My inbox is full of threats and demands for apologies. "Do you want the legal team to draft a cease and desist?" Felix asked. "We can have those posts taken down for defamation before lunch. It would be effortless." "No," I said immediately. "Do not touch the posts. Let him keep them up. Let him gather all the public support he wants. The more he talks about integrity and hard work right now, the sweeter the irony will be when we expose what he is actually doing in the dark. How are we looking on the Vanguard Logistics acquisition?" Felix paused, and I could hear the sound of papers shuffling on his end of the line. The bait was taken. Cameron replied to the initial interest email from Apex Holdings at 6 this morning. He is eager, Tessa, almost painfully eager. He agreed to our non-disclosure agreements and sent over his preliminary financial summaries for our review. He thinks he is talking to a faceless corporate entity that is just going to hand him $30 million without looking under the hood. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking out over the city. "He is desperate," I said. "He needs this buyout to hide whatever is really going wrong at Vanguard. Have the forensic accounting team start digging. Do not just look at the summaries he provided. I want a full, aggressive audit of every single bank account associated with that company. I want to know where every dollar came from and exactly where it went." "Already on it," Felix said. "Our team has full authorization to conduct deep due diligence as part of the proxy negotiations. We are pulling their operational costs, vendor contracts, and tax filings now. If he is hiding something, we will find it. Find it quickly," I instructed. "And keep the pressure on him. Send him a list of aggressive demands. Tell him Apex Holdings requires full transparency to proceed. Make him feel like the deal of a lifetime is right at his fingertips, but he has to jump through our hoops to get it. I want him entirely distracted by this acquisition." "Understood," Felix replied. "I will have the proxy lawyers schedule a preliminary conference call with him for this afternoon. We will make him sweat." I ended the call and placed the phone back on the counter. The silence of the penthouse returned, a stark contrast to the digital noise my family was creating. They thought they had won the weekend. They thought they had successfully exiled the family failure and protected their precious legacy. They were currently celebrating their perceived victory, completely unaware that I had just dispatched a team of the most ruthless financial auditors in the country to tear their golden child's company apart, piece by piece. I looked at the notifications still popping up on my screen. Each one, a new insult, a new lie, a new attempt to break my spirit. I did not feel broken. I felt powerful. I was no longer the helpless sister standing in the rain. I was the architect of their impending destruction, and the demolition had officially begun. I walked into my home office, a sleek room dominated by a massive glass desk and 3 high-resolution monitors. I sat down in my leather chair, tapped the keyboard, and brought up the secure corporate portal for Apex Holdings. This was my battlefield. Within an hour, Felix had mobilized our forensic accounting division. Under the guise of standard due diligence for the $30 million acquisition, our team requested full access to the financial records of Vanguard Logistics. Because Cameron was so desperate to secure the buyout, he practically handed over the keys to his kingdom without a second thought. He authorized the massive data transfer by 10 in the morning, entirely unaware that he had just invited the most ruthless auditors in the country into his poorly guarded corporate vault. I pulled up the incoming data streams on my monitors. The raw financial files poured in rapidly. Spreadsheets, tax documents, vendor contracts, and payroll records filled my screens. For the next several hours, I immersed myself entirely in the numbers. While my family spent their day gossiping on social media and patting themselves on the back for their perceived moral superiority, I was systematically dismantling the illusion of their success. It did not take long for the first red flags to appear. Vanguard Logistics was not just a failing company, it was a chaotic mess of gross incompetence and structural rot. I saw the massive operational leaks Felix had mentioned the previous night. Cameron was bleeding capital on outdated software licenses and overpaying third-party contractors because his own internal routing systems were constantly crashing. He lacked the basic technical comprehension to fix the very foundation of his business. But as I dug deeper into the general ledger, something else caught my eye entirely. The numbers were not just reflecting poor management. They were deliberately obfuscated. There were gaps in the accounting that did not align with standard operational losses. I picked up my phone and dialed the secure line to Felix. He answered on the first ring. "Are you seeing what I am seeing in the quarterly expense reports?" I asked, my eyes scanning a highly suspicious column of recurring payments. Felix let out a heavy breath. "I was just about to call you. My lead auditor, a man who could spot a missing cent in a billion-dollar spreadsheet, just flagged a massive series of shell companies listed under Vanguard Logistics vendor payouts. Cameron has been funneling investor capital into dummy corporations registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands." I leaned closer to the monitor, my fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate the data points. "He is creating fake invoices for logistics services that were never rendered," I said, pulling up the matching dates. "Exactly," Felix confirmed. "He is paying ghost vendors for phantom shipping routes, and once the money hits those shell accounts, it is immediately transferred out. We trace the routing numbers through our international banking contacts. The funds are being diverted directly into Cameron's personal offshore accounts. He is not just losing money through bad business practices, Tessa. He is actively embezzling from his own venture capital investors." The sheer audacity of it left me momentarily speechless. Cameron, the golden boy, the untouchable genius of the family, was a common thief. He was stealing millions of dollars to fund his lavish lifestyle and prop up his fragile ego. I pulled up his recent public asset acquisitions on another screen. The new luxury sports cars, the $50,000 country club initiation fees, the custom-tailored suits he wore while calling me a useless failure. All of it was bought with stolen money. He was essentially running a corporate Ponzi scheme, moving capital from new investors to cover the glaring holes in his operational budget while skimming millions off the top for himself. He stood in that foyer and told me I was a drain on society. I said, the bitter irony settling deep in my chest. Meanwhile, he is robbing his own partners blind to pay for his cars. "How deep does the fraud go?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Deep enough to trigger a massive federal investigation," Felix replied. "But that is not even the most interesting part of the audit. Look at the loan origination documents from 2 years ago. Specifically, the mezzanine financing he secured to keep the company afloat during their last major cash flow crisis." I opened the corresponding financial file. It was a massive high-interest loan from a prominent private equity firm designed to inject quick capital into Vanguard Logistics. As I scrolled down to the guarantor section at the bottom of the legal document, my heart completely stopped. The primary signature belonged to Cameron, but sitting right next to it on the line designated for the silent partner and secondary guarantor was a signature I had known my entire life. Harrison. My father. I stared at the black ink on the digital document. My father had not just given Cameron seed money when he started the business. He had legally bound himself to Vanguard Logistics as a silent partner. He had co-signed the fraudulent loans, leveraging his own personal assets and immense suburban wealth to secure the capital Cameron desperately needed. Does my father know about the embezzlement? I asked, my mind racing through the catastrophic legal implications of that single signature. Felix was quiet for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation hang in the air. Based on the communication logs we requested from their internal servers, yes. Your father knew everything. We found a chain of encrypted emails between Harrison and Cameron dating back 8 months. Your father was actively advising Cameron on how to structure the ghost vendor payouts to avoid triggering an audit from their primary investors. They conspired together to falsify the revenue projections so they could secure another round of funding. The reality of the situation washed over me like a tidal wave of ice water. My father, the man who had stood in his pristine foyer and screamed that I was a drain on his legacy, was an active participant in a federal financial crime. He had thrown me out into the rain claiming I was a worthless disappointment, all while he was secretly hiding a multi-million-dollar fraud that could destroy his entire life. The hypocrisy was so profound, almost made me laugh aloud in the empty office. They had projected all of their own moral rot onto me because I was an easy, convenient target. They needed me to be the failure so no one would look closely at their own glittering success. They need this $30 million buyout, I said, leaning back in my leather chair. The realization was snapping into sharp, beautiful focus. It all made perfect sense now. They are absolutely desperate for it, Felix agreed. Their primary investors have scheduled an independent audit for the end of next month. If Vanguard Logistics is not acquired by then, the investors will discover the missing funds. The embezzlement will be completely exposed. They are not just looking at corporate bankruptcy, Tessa. If they do not get this anonymous buyout cash to quietly fill the massive holes in their accounts and cover their tracks, Cameron and Harrison are going to federal prison. I looked out the window of my penthouse. The city below was completely unaware of the corporate execution I was currently orchestrating from my desk. My family thought they had successfully exiled me. They thought they had protected their precious secrets by keeping me out of their house and smearing my name on social media. They had no idea that by trying to secure this acquisition, they had just handed me the absolute power to destroy them entirely. They needed an anonymous billionaire savior to rescue them from the consequences of their own arrogance and greed. They needed Apex Holdings to write them a massive check so they could walk away clean and continue pretending they were the masters of their universe. Instruct the legal team to proceed with the proxy negotiations. I told Felix, my voice ringing with absolute, unwavering certainty. Let Cameron believe the deal is moving forward flawlessly. Give him no reason to suspect we know anything about the fraud. I want him to feel entirely safe. I want him to believe he has pulled off the greatest con of his life and that his salvation is guaranteed. And what about the embezzlement evidence? Felix asked. Compile everything I instructed. Every fake invoice, every offshore transfer, every single email between my brother and my father, proving their deliberate conspiracy. Build a comprehensive, undeniable dossier. Lock it down on our secure servers. We are going to let them walk right into the trap they built for themselves. I ended the call and let the silence of the office surround me once again. The digital files on my monitors glowed brightly, displaying the undeniable proof of my family's impending ruin. They had told me to go live in the streets. They had promised I would be begging them for mercy by Tuesday morning. But the truth was finally laid bare on the screens in front of me. They were the ones standing blindfolded on the edge of a sheer cliff, and I was the only one holding the parachute. I was not going to give them the parachute. I was going to cut the cords and watch them fall. By 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the rain had completely dried up across Austin, but the storm inside my pristine downtown penthouse was just gathering strength. Tuesday morning. That was the exact deadline my brother had given me. He had stood on that covered porch looking down at my soaking wet clothes and promised I would be calling him begging for a loan by Tuesday morning when reality set in. I was not holding a phone trying to reach him. Instead, I was sitting in my private soundproof executive suite, sipping a fresh espresso and staring at a wall-mounted monitor displaying a secure video feed. Down the hall, in the primary glass-enclosed boardroom of Apex Holdings, Felix was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table. He was flanked by three of our most ruthless corporate acquisition attorneys. They were staring at a large screen displaying the video conference feed from Vanguard Logistics. There, sitting in a rented executive suite that was desperately trying to look successful, was Cameron. He was wearing a custom navy blue suit that I knew he had bought with embezzled funds. His hair was perfectly styled, and he was leaning back in his chair with a forced posture of absolute confidence. He had absolutely no idea that his useless bankrupt sister was sitting 50 feet away, watching his every move through a muted audio and video link. I adjusted the volume on my desk console. Felix's voice filled my office, smooth, professional, and dangerously sharp. Thank you for making the time this morning, Cameron. The CEO of Apex Holdings has reviewed your preliminary pitch deck and finds your regional footprint intriguing. However, before we discuss the $30 million valuation you proposed, we need to address some glaring operational inefficiencies our team has flagged. Cameron offered a slick, practiced smile. I watched his body language closely. He was trying to project the image of a titan of industry, but I could see the subtle signs of panic. The slight twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped nervously against his expensive leather portfolio. Of course, Felix Cameron said, his voice dripping with false charm. Any growing logistic firm experiences growing pains. We are currently scaling our operations so rapidly that our infrastructure is simply catching up to our massive market share. The $30 million valuation is actually a bargain for Apex Holdings. We have two other private equity firms currently circling us, but I prefer the strategic alignment Apex offers. I actually laughed out loud in my empty office. He was bluffing. It was a blatant, arrogant lie. There were no other private equity firms circling Vanguard Logistics. The company was toxic, bleeding capital, and weeks away from a federal audit that would expose his multi-million-dollar fraud. But this was exactly who Cameron had always been. As I watched him lie through his teeth to my business partner, I was transported back to our childhood. Cameron had never been held accountable for a single mistake in his entire life. When we were teenagers, he totaled my father's vintage sports car by drag racing it drunk on a back road. Instead of punishing him, my mother had blamed the wet pavement, and my father had bought him a brand new truck to make up for the trauma of the accident. When Cameron failed his college finance courses, my parents donated a new wing to the university library, and his grades miraculously transformed into passing marks. They had taught him that reality was flexible, that rules applied to everyone else, and that his charm and their money could overwrite any failure. I was doing the exact same thing right now. He thought he could sit in front of a multi-billion-dollar acquisition team and simply lie his way out of catastrophic financial ruin. He believed his own hype. He genuinely thought he was the smartest person in the room. Felix did not miss a beat. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the boardroom table. That is fascinating, Cameron, because our preliminary analysis shows a 50% drop in your on-time delivery metrics over the last quarter. You are hemorrhaging retail contracts. Your fuel expenditures are completely out of alignment with your projected routes. If I am being entirely candid, Vanguard Logistics looks less like a scaling empire and more like a sinking ship. The slick smile vanished from Cameron's face. His posture stiffened. The golden child did not like being questioned. He was used to my father nodding along and writing a check whenever things got difficult. You are looking at raw data without the operational context. Cameron snapped, his tone turning defensive. We are restructuring our vendor payouts to optimize our tax burden. The drop in metrics is a temporary byproduct of upgrading our third-party fleet. The core value of Vanguard is our proprietary client network. If Apex Holdings cannot see that, maybe I should take my business back to the other firms. I typed a rapid message on my secure terminal, sending it directly to Felix's hidden earpiece. Call his bluff. Tell him to walk. Tell him the offer drops to $25 million and it is a take-it-or-leave-it scenario. I watched the monitor as Felix paused for a fraction of a second, receiving my instruction. He closed his leather portfolio with a definitive, dismissive snap. Then I suggest you call those other firms, Cameron. Apex Holdings does not negotiate with partners who refuse to acknowledge their own operational reality. We are prepared to offer a flat $25 million for the total acquisition of Vanguard Logistics, including all physical assets and client lists. We will assume your operational debts, but the valuation drops immediately. Cameron's face went completely pale. The arrogant mask shattered. He had asked for $30 million because he desperately needed to cover the massive holes he and my father had torn into the company's ledger. Dropping the price by $5 million meant he would barely escape with his freedom, let alone a profit. But he had absolutely no leverage. He was cornered, and the panic was finally showing in his eyes. $25 million is an insult, Cameron stammered, his voice rising in pitch. The infrastructure alone is worth more than that. I cannot take that number back to my silent partners. You can take it back to them, or you can take your company into bankruptcy by the end of the month, Felix said, his voice cold and unforgiving. We know about the independent investor audit scheduled for 4 weeks from now, Cameron. We know exactly how little time you have. $25 million, all cash. Expedited closing within 14 days. Take it or we end this call right now. I held my breath watching the screen. I knew my brother. I knew his greed, but more importantly, I knew his profound cowardice. He was terrified of being exposed. He was terrified of losing his country club status, his luxury cars, and the misplaced adoration of our parents. Cameron swallowed hard. He looked off camera for a moment, likely calculating how quickly he could funnel the $25 million into his offshore accounts to cover up the embezzlement before the federal authorities noticed. When he looked back at the camera, he looked like a beaten man trying desperately to retain a shred of dignity. Fine, Cameron said the word, tasting like poison in his mouth. We will accept the $25 million valuation. But we need to expedite the paperwork immediately. I want this closed and funded as soon as possible. Felix offered a tight professional nod. Our legal team will draft the final acquisition documents. We require absolute transparency moving forward. You will hear from us shortly. The video feed cut out. The screen on my wall went black. I sat back in my leather chair, letting out a long, slow breath. The trap was set. Cameron had taken the bait out of pure, unadulterated desperation. He thought he had just survived by the skin of his teeth. He thought he had successfully manipulated a massive corporate entity into bailing him out of his own criminal negligence. He was probably picking up his phone right now, texting my father to tell him that their crisis was averted, that the golden boy had saved the day once again. The intercom on my desk buzzed. Felix's voice came through the speaker. We have verbal agreement on the $25 million. He is sweating bullets, Tessa. He took the lower valuation so fast it practically gave him whiplash. Have the legal team start drafting the final acquisition contract immediately, I instructed, pressing the intercom button. Bury the ironclad liability clause deep in the paperwork. I want it completely camouflaged under standard merger jargon, but legally inescapable. Make sure it explicitly states that the sellers assume absolute personal and criminal liability for any financial discrepancies discovered after the ink dries. Consider it done, Felix replied. What is your next move? I stood up from my desk, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the sprawling city, thinking about my mother sneering from her staircase, telling me to go buy a decent meal. I thought about the $50 bill she probably kept in her purse just to flash at waiters. My next move is simple, I said, a cold smile forming on my lips. I am going to get a cup of coffee. It is time to let my family see the failure they threw out into the rain. I left my office and took the private elevator down to the bustling street level. The financial district of Austin was alive with the mid-morning rush. Corporate executives in sharp custom suits hurried past me, clutching leather briefcases and shouting into their mobile devices. I blended right in with the shadows. I had draped a worn beige trench coat over my clothes, the very same cheap coat I had worn when my father kicked me out into the storm. It was a disguise, a deliberate costume designed to project exactly what my family expected to see when they looked at me. I walked 3 blocks to an exclusive high-end cafe known for its artisanal roasts and incredibly arrogant clientele. It was exactly the kind of place my mother and brother frequented when they wanted to be seen by the right people. The cafe was a symphony of clinking porcelain and hushed, wealthy conversations. I ordered a simple black coffee and took a seat at a small marble table near the center of the room. I did not have to wait long. Less than 10 minutes later, the heavy glass doors swung open. Cameron walked in, flanked by our mother Beatrice. They looked like they had just conquered the entire world. Cameron was practically glowing, radiating a smug, self-satisfied energy that filled the room. He was holding his phone in one hand, gesturing wildly with the other, as he recounted his proxy meeting with Felix. Beatrice was nodding along her designer handbag, clutched tightly, hanging onto his every word, as if he were a prophet delivering good news. They took a table just a few yards away from mine. I kept my head down, staring into my coffee cup, but I listened intently. Cameron was speaking loudly, making sure the neighboring tables could hear about his massive success. He bragged to Beatrice about how he had masterfully negotiated a $25 million all-cash buyout. He spun a ridiculous fabricated tale about how he had played hard to get, how the massive corporate entity across the table had practically begged him to accept their money. Cameron continued to embellish the details, claiming the anonymous CEO of Apex Holdings was practically weeping with gratitude to acquire such a stellar asset. He had no idea his entire narrative was a complete fantasy. Beatrice praised his business acumen, calling him the undisputed savior of the family legacy. She loudly proclaimed that his father was already looking into buying a new yacht to celebrate the acquisition. They were completely blinded by their own hubris, celebrating a victory that was actually a beautifully disguised death sentence. I shifted in my chair, allowing the fabric of my worn trench coat to rustle. The movement caught my mother's eye. Beatrice turned her head, her gaze sweeping over the cafe before landing directly on me. Her perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up in genuine shock, followed immediately by a look of profound disgust. She tapped Cameron on the arm and pointed in my direction. Cameron stopped mid-sentence. His arrogant smile curdled into a sneer. Beatrice did not hesitate. She stood up, smoothing the front of her expensive silk blouse, and marched directly toward my table. Cameron followed closely behind her like a loyal guard dog. The conversations at the surrounding tables began to quiet down as people sensed the impending drama. Beatrice stopped right in front of me, looking down her nose as if my very presence in the cafe was an insult to her eyesight. "What on earth are you doing here?" Beatrice demanded, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "This cafe is for working professionals, Tessa, not vagrants looking to escape the humidity outside." I looked up slowly, meeting her eyes with a calm, neutral expression. "I am just having a cup of coffee, Mom. It is a public place." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Public does not mean appropriate for everyone. You look like an absolute disaster. I told you to go live in the streets, but I did not think you would actually start dressing like it so quickly. You are an embarrassment to look at." Cameron stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest. He puffed out his chest, looking down at me with pure contempt. "You should not even be in this part of town, Tessa. This zip code is for people who actually build things, people who contribute to the economy. But I guess you would not know anything about that since your only talent is failing spectacularly and begging for handouts." I kept my hands resting quietly on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. "How is Vanguard Logistics doing, Cameron?" I asked simply. Cameron let out a loud, theatrical scoff, making sure the executives at the next table were watching. "Vanguard Logistics is doing better than you could ever possibly comprehend in your pathetic little life. As a matter of fact, I just secured a multi-million-dollar acquisition deal this morning. A massive corporate entity is buying my company for $25 million in pure cash. They recognized my operational genius. They practically threw the money at me. I have investors lining up around the block begging to give me their capital. You are nothing but a ghost in the business world. I am about to become a corporate legend, and you are sitting here in a dirty coat, nursing a $5 coffee you probably cannot even afford." Beatrice shook her head, her face twisted with a mixture of pity and revulsion. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her wallet. She snapped open the clasp, extracted a crisp $50 bill, and dropped it directly onto my table. It landed right next to my coffee cup. "Take it," Beatrice commanded loudly, ensuring the entire cafe witnessed her supposed charity. "Go buy yourself a decent meal and maybe a clean shirt. And then leave this part of town." Your brother is about to close the biggest deal of his life, and we cannot have you loitering around the financial district making our family look like a charity case. We are done dealing with your failures. I looked down at the $50 bill resting on the marble table. It was the ultimate insult, a public display of their immense wealth designed to make me feel as small and insignificant as possible. They expected me to cry. They expected me to throw the money back in their faces, to cause a scene to prove that I was the unstable, bitter failure they claimed I was. They wanted a reaction they could point to as proof of my unworthiness. Instead, I reached out and picked up the $50 bill. I folded it neatly and slipped it into the pocket of my worn trench coat. I looked up at my mother and then at my brother, and I gave them a chillingly polite smile. "Thank you for your generosity," I said, my voice perfectly steady and serene. "You have no idea how much this means to me. I will be sure to put it to very good use." Beatrice looked momentarily unsettled by my calm reaction, but her arrogance quickly smoothed over her confusion. "Just stay out of our way," she snapped, turning on her heel and marching back to her table. Cameron gave me one last look of absolute disdain before following her. I did not linger. I picked up my coffee cup, took one final sip, and stood up from the table. I walked out of the cafe feeling the eyes of the other patrons watching me go. As the heavy glass doors shut behind me, the warm Texas air wrapped around me. I walked down the street, my hand resting in my pocket against the $50 bill. It was a trophy, a physical reminder of their boundless arrogance. I pulled my secure encrypted phone from my other pocket and hit a single speed dial button. Felix answered immediately. "Did you enjoy your coffee?" Felix asked. "It was incredibly enlightening," I replied, walking past a row of high-end boutiques. "They are celebrating their victory." Cameron is loudly bragging to anyone who will listen about his operational genius and his impending $25 million payday. My mother just tipped me $50 to go buy a clean shirt, so I do not embarrass them in public. I could hear the smile in Felix's voice over the line. How kind of her. What is the status of the acquisition paperwork? Green light, the final phase of the trap. I instructed, my voice hard and absolute. Execute the documents immediately. Send the ironclad liability contract directly to Cameron's inbox. Do not give him time to breathe. Tell him Apex Holdings requires his signature and Harrison's Kyo signature by the end of the business day to secure the expedited funds. Let their greed blind them to the fine print. The paperwork is already generated, Felix confirmed. The liability clause is buried on page 47, completely legally binding and utterly inescapable. They will assume full personal and criminal responsibility for every single fraudulent transaction hidden in Vanguard's ledgers. I am sending it now. I paused at the crosswalk, looking up at the towering glass skyscraper that housed my corporate empire. "Let me know the exact second they sign their lives away," I said. "We are going to let them buy their own rope, and then we are going to watch them hang." I walked the remaining distance to the glass tower that housed my company and rode the private elevator up to the executive floor. The air inside the office was electric with focused energy. Felix was already waiting for me in the main conference room, surrounded by three of our sharpest corporate attorneys. I read over the paragraph one last time. It was a masterpiece of legal entrapment hidden in plain sight. "Send it," I told Felix. "Send the final draft directly to Cameron. Tell him we need the digital signatures from both the primary executive and the silent partner before 5 o'clock this evening to authorize the immediate transfer of the $25 million. Make sure he understands that any delay will result in Apex Holdings walking away from the deal entirely." Felix nodded and hit a button on his keyboard. The document vanished from our screens, hurtling through the digital space toward my arrogant brother. The countdown had officially begun. I knew exactly how Cameron would react when that email hit his inbox. He would see the $25 million figure, and his mind would go completely blank to anything else. Cameron was backed into a corner of his own making. The independent investor audit was looming like a dark cloud over his head, and he needed our cash to fill the massive holes in his accounts before the federal authorities were alerted. Across the city, inside the rented corporate suite of Vanguard Logistics, my brother was likely sweating through his custom suit. Through the digital tracking software embedded in our secure document portal, Felix and I could monitor exactly when the contract was opened. The notification pinged on Felix's monitor less than 3 minutes after the email was sent. Cameron had opened the file. I pictured him sitting at his desk, calling our father in a panic of excitement. I imagined my father answering the phone in his pristine suburban study, feeling that familiar rush of superiority, thinking he had successfully navigated another crisis, using nothing but his checkbook and his golden child's supposed charm. The tracking software showed that Cameron scrolled through the entire 70-page document in less than 4 minutes. There was absolutely no way he read a single word of the actual legal stipulations. He was just looking for the signature line and the payment terms. I saw the guarantee of $25 million and immediately forwarded the contract to his own legal representation. This was the moment of truth. If Cameron had hired a competent high-tier corporate law firm, they would have spotted the ironclad liability clause immediately. They would have flagged the aggressive language and advised him to walk away from the deal or demand a massive renegotiation. But Cameron did not have a high-tier corporate law firm. He was bleeding capital and drowning in hidden debt. He had hired a lower-tier firm of regional attorneys who were more accustomed to handling simple warehouse leases than navigating multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions by aggressive tech empires. Even so, the clause was so blatantly dangerous that even a first-year law student would have raised an alarm. 15 minutes later, a notification popped up showing that Cameron's legal team had accessed the contract. For the next hour, the office was completely silent. I paced the length of the boardroom playing out the conversation happening across town. I knew the exact dynamic at play. Cameron's lawyers were undoubtedly calling him in a panic. They would be pointing to page 47, warning him that the liability clause was financial suicide if the company books were not perfectly clean. They would tell him that signing this document meant waiving all personal protections and assuming full criminal responsibility for any historical financial irregularities. They would beg him not to sign it. But I also knew my brother and my father better than anyone else. I knew their arrogance. Cameron would never admit to his lawyers that the company books were completely fabricated. He could not confess to the embezzlement without implicating himself and exposing the fraud to his own legal team. He had to maintain the facade of the visionary CEO whose company was in perfect health. To refuse the clause would look suspicious. It would signal to Apex Holdings and to his own attorneys that he had something massive to hide. Furthermore, he and my father were cornered by their own greed. They needed that $25 million by the end of the week to replace the funds they had stolen before the investors ripped their company apart. They were trapped between the certainty of federal prison if the investor audit proceeded and the gamble of signing a dangerous contract with an anonymous corporation they thought they could outsmart. My father had always taught Cameron that rules were meant for other people. He had spent his entire life bailing Cameron out of trouble, shielding him from the consequences of his actions. They honestly believed they were smarter than the lawyers holding the pen. They believed that once they had the $25 million in their offshore accounts, they could bury the paper trail so deep that Apex Holdings would never be able to prove the historical fraud. They thought they could sign the liability clause, take the money, and simply vanish into their wealthy suburban bubble, leaving my holding company holding an empty bag. They were so blinded by their desperation and their lifelong habit of getting away with everything that they willfully ignored the flashing red lights right in front of them. The digital clock on the boardroom wall clicked forward. It was now 2 in the afternoon. The deadline was approaching. Will they sign it? Felix asked, his voice quiet in the tense room. Are they arrogant enough to jump directly into the fire? They will sign it, I said with absolute certainty. They have no other choice, and their egos will not allow them to admit defeat. They would rather risk everything on a bad contract than admit to the world that they are frauds. At 3:15 in the afternoon, the system chimed loudly, echoing through the executive suite. A bright green notification banner flashed across Felix's primary monitor. Document executed. Felix sat up straight, his fingers flying across the keyboard to open the authenticated file. He projected it onto the main screen for the entire legal team to see. There, at the very bottom of the final page, were two digital signatures. The first was a hurried, messy scrawl belonging to my brother Cameron. The second was the sharp, precise signature of my father Harrison, confirming his position as the silent partner and secondary guarantor. They had done it. They had completely disregarded their lawyer's warnings. They had overridden basic legal sense and signed the ironclad liability clause without a single modification. They had officially assumed absolute personal, financial, and criminal responsibility for the millions of dollars they had embezzled from their own investors. The acquisition was legally binding, and my trap had just snapped completely shut around their necks. I watched the digital confirmation process finalize with a deeply satisfying click of finality. Felix let out a sharp breath of disbelief, shaking his head as he stared at the signatures on the screen. They just handed you the legal authority to destroy them, and they did not even ask a single question. I stared at my father's signature on the massive screen. The same man who had thrown my bag into the freezing rain and told me I was a useless failure had just legally signed over his entire life to me. He thought he was outsmarting an anonymous billionaire. He had no idea he had just surrendered everything to the daughter he discarded. Verify the signatures and lock the documents in the secure vault. I instructed, my voice steady and cold. Prepare the asset liquidation protocols. By the time they realize what they have done, they will not have a single dollar left to their names. My mother Beatrice was the first to reply. Her response was flooded with celebratory emojis and excessive praise. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant boy," she wrote. "I always knew you were destined for greatness. You have secured the family legacy forever. Your father and I are crying tears of joy. We are so incredibly proud of the man you have become." My father chimed in a few seconds later. He was the silent partner who had just legally signed away his own life, yet he was celebrating like he had won the lottery. "Outstanding work, son," he typed. "You played the negotiations perfectly. You showed that faceless corporation exactly what our family is made of. We celebrate tonight." I sat in my high-security penthouse and read their words with a slow, chilling smile. They were congratulating each other for successfully committing a catastrophic financial suicide. They truly believed they had outsmarted a massive tech empire. They thought they had secured $25 million to quietly cover up their embezzlement and fund their lavish lifestyles for the rest of their lives. The hubris was so thick, it practically radiated from the digital screen. But Cameron was not finished. His ego demanded a victim. He needed someone to look down on to make his perceived victory feel complete. And as always, I was his favorite target. "Hey Tessa," Cameron wrote, directly tagging my phone number in the chat. "Are you enjoying the streets yet? I hope you are paying attention to this chat from whatever cheap motel you crawled into. This is what actual success looks like. This is what happens when you have real talent and drive. I just made $25 million before lunch, and you could not even give away your worthless code. Some people are born to be leaders, and some people are born to be failures. Enjoy being a failure." My mother immediately supported his cruelty. "Do not waste your energy on her," Cameron Beatrice replied. "She made her choices. We are focusing entirely on positive energy and family success today. She is no longer our concern." I read the messages twice, letting the sheer toxicity of their words wash over me. A weaker version of myself. The 28-year-old girl who had gone bankrupt 5 years ago would have been devastated by those texts. I would have cried. I would have typed out a long, desperate defense of my character, begging them to see my worth. But that girl was dead. I did not feel an ounce of pain. I felt nothing but a cold, surgical satisfaction. They were digging their own graves and proudly posting photos of the shovels. I did not reply to the group chat. I simply took a screenshot of the conversation and saved it to my encrypted server. It was another piece of evidence, another digital trophy of their arrogance. I set the phone face down on my desk just as Felix walked into my office. He was holding a fresh cup of coffee and a folder containing the finalized acquisition documents. "They are celebrating," I told Felix, leaning back in my chair. "Cameron just told the family group chat that he is a corporate legend. My parents are calling him a genius." He also took the time to specifically remind me that I am a useless failure who will never know what success looks like. Felix let out a short, incredulous laugh. He shook his head and took a seat across from my desk. The delusion is almost impressive. They have legally bound themselves to absolute financial ruin, and they are popping champagne. How do you want to proceed with the final phase? It is time to meet the corporate legend in person, I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous calm. Send Cameron an official communication from Apex Holdings. Inform him that the anonymous billionaire chief executive officer is absolutely thrilled with the acquisition. Tell him the CEO requests a formal in-person dinner to celebrate the partnership and finalize the transition of assets. Felix smiled, pulling out his tablet to draft the message. Where do you want to host this execution? Book the private ultra-exclusive dining room at the Monarch, I instructed. It was the most expensive elitist five-star restaurant in downtown Austin. My parents had been trying to get a reservation in that specific private room for years, but it was strictly reserved for high-profile corporate titans and billionaires. It was the perfect stage for their downfall. Tell Cameron the dinner is scheduled for this Friday evening at 8 o'clock. Insist that he brings his primary investor and silent partner. He will absolutely bring our father, and my mother will refuse to be left out of such a high society event. Consider the invitation sent, Felix said, tapping his screen. I will make sure the wording strokes his ego. He needs to walk into that restaurant thinking he is about to shake hands with a billionaire who worships his business acumen. Let him think whatever he wants for the next 3 days, I replied. Let his ego inflate to the breaking point. Over the next 48 hours, Cameron did exactly what I expected him to do. He lost his mind with the illusion of his new wealth. Through our monitoring of Vanguard Logistics' financial accounts, we saw the immediate reckless fallout of his hubris. Because the $25 million buyout cash was scheduled to hit his accounts after the celebratory dinner, Cameron decided he did not need to wait to start spending. He believed his future was absolutely guaranteed. He believed the money was already his. On Wednesday afternoon, my brother walked into a high-end exotic car dealership in the hills of Austin. We knew this because he immediately posted a live video on his social media accounts. I watched the video from my office monitor. Cameron was strutting around a pristine jet black sports car that cost easily over $300,000. He was laughing, tossing the keys in the air, and telling his followers that hard work always pays off. He filmed himself signing the financing paperwork, proudly declaring that he was buying the car on credit because a massive 8-figure wire transfer was clearing by the end of the week. How was leveraging his non-existent future wealth to finance a luxury car he absolutely could not afford. He was piling massive personal debt on top of his hidden corporate embezzlement, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire financial safety net was an illusion controlled by the sister he despised. My mother was equally unhinged in her arrogance. Beatrice posted photos of herself at a high-end designer boutique purchasing a custom evening gown for what she vaguely described as the most exclusive corporate dinner in Texas history. She bragged to her socialite friends that her son was being courted by an anonymous billionaire and that the family was entering a new stratosphere of wealth. They were spending money they did not have to impress people who did not care, all based on a contract that was designed to destroy them. By Thursday evening, the anticipation in my penthouse was palpable. Felix and the legal team had finalized the physical dossiers. We had printed every single piece of evidence proving Cameron and Harrison had embezzled millions of dollars from Vanguard Logistics. We had copies of the fake invoices, the offshore routing numbers, and the encrypted emails, where my father actively advised Cameron on how to hide the stolen funds from their investors. We placed all of these documents into thick, heavy black folders. These folders would serve as the main course for our Friday night dinner. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my master bedroom, making my final preparations for the confrontation. I was not going to wear a cheap, worn trench coat. I was not going to hide my success anymore. I had a custom-tailored midnight blue designer suit prepared for the occasion. It was sharp, authoritative, and radiated quiet, undeniable power. I paired it with a simple, elegant watch that cost more than the sports car Cameron had just financed. I wanted to look exactly like the multi-million-dollar chief executive officer they were so desperate to impress. My phone vibrated on the dresser. It was one final text message from Cameron in the family group chat. He was confirming the dinner plans with our parents. I cannot wait to look this billionaire in the eye and show him how Vanguard operates, Cameron wrote. We are going to own this city by Monday. Make sure you both look perfect tomorrow night. We are stepping into the big leagues now. I locked the screen of my phone and stared at my reflection in the glass. He was right about one thing. They were stepping into the big leagues. They were about to step into a room and look the billionaire CEO right in the eye. They just had absolutely no idea that the billionaire was the daughter they threw away. The trap was fully armed. The golden child had sprinted directly into the center of the snare, blinded by his own radiant hubris. All that was left to do was pull the lever. I turned off the lights in my bedroom and prepared for the slaughter. Friday evening draped over the city, like a velvet curtain setting the stage for the final act. The Monarch was not just a restaurant, it was an institution of wealth, an architectural marvel of dark wood imported stone and hushed exclusivity, nestled in the very heart of the financial district. To simply walk through its front doors was a statement of power. To command the private dining suite at the rear of the establishment, a soundproof enclave known as the Regent Room, was a privilege reserved exclusively for billionaires visiting dignitaries and corporate titans. My family had arrived exactly 20 minutes early, practically vibrating with a toxic mixture of arrogance and adrenaline. I knew this because Felix and I had already been in the building for an hour, utilizing a private executive entrance reserved for the restaurant's top investors. We were waiting in an adjacent, dimly lit antechamber that shared a heavy set of double mahogany doors with the Regent Room. Through the thick, polished wood, the acoustics of the private suite carried their voices directly to us. I stood silently in the dark, smoothing the lapels of my custom-tailored midnight blue suit. It was a masterpiece of quiet luxury, devoid of flashy logos, but exuding an undeniable commanding authority. Behind me stood Felix, checking his watch with surgical precision, alongside two of the most ruthless, highly compensated corporate attorneys in the state of Texas. We were a firing squad dressed in designer silk, and we were simply waiting for the condemned to finish their final meal. Through the heavy wood, the sound of a popping cork echoed sharply, followed by the clinking of fine crystal. Cameron was holding court. To the Vanguard legacy. Cameron boasted, his voice loud, booming, and completely intoxicated by his own perceived genius. I could picture him perfectly standing at the head of the long table wearing his new suit, completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing on a trapdoor. We did it. $25 million in pure cash. By Monday morning, the investor audit will not find a single thing out of place. We played them perfectly. I listened as my father, Harrison, chuckled warmly. It was the rich, rumbling laugh of a man who believed he was entirely immune to consequence. You negotiated like a true visionary, Cameron. You held your ground and you secured the family future. I have to admit, when the lawyers flagged that liability clause yesterday, I had a brief moment of concern. But you were right. It was just standard corporate intimidation. They wanted the company too badly to look closely at the books. We take the money, we cover the operational gaps, and we walk away completely clean. It was staggering. They were openly discussing their financial fraud in a public restaurant, so insulated by their lifelong privilege that they felt completely safe admitting to federal crimes over appetizers. They honestly believed that because they possessed a certain zip code and a country club membership, the law simply did not apply to them. My mother Beatrice chimed in next. Her voice was dripping with that familiar syrupy vanity. I always knew you were destined to be a titan, Cameron. I was telling the ladies at the boutique today that my son was being personally courted by an anonymous billionaire. Do you know how many people would kill for this kind of opportunity? It just proves that breeding matters. We are a family of winners. Cameron laughed, a harsh, grating sound that I recognized from the night he shoved me out into the freezing rain. And to think Tessa actually believed she was somehow on my level just because she wrote a few lines of code. Imagine if she could see us right now. She is probably sitting in a cheap diner somewhere completely miserable while we are about to shake hands with a billionaire. I almost wish she was here just so I could see the look of absolute defeat on her face when the CEO walks through those doors. I turned slightly, catching Felix's eye in the dim light of the antechamber. He raised a single, perfectly groomed eyebrow. A small, cold smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Careful what you wish for," Felix murmured softly, just loud enough for me to hear. The digital clock on Felix's wrist flashed 8 o'clock precisely. It was time. I gave a curt, sharp nod to the two corporate attorneys standing behind me. They stepped forward, flanking my right side, carrying the heavy black folders that contained the forensic audit, the fake invoices, the offshore routing numbers, and the signed acquisition contract. Felix stepped to my left, his posture rigid and commanding. I reached out and placed my hands on the brass handles of the heavy mahogany doors. My heart was not racing. My palms were not sweating. I felt a profound, chilling stillness. The 28-year-old girl who had desperately craved their validation was entirely gone. I was the architect of their destruction, and I was about to walk into my own masterpiece. I pushed the heavy doors open. They swung inward with a smooth, silent glide, revealing the stunning opulence of the Regent Room. A massive crystal chandelier hung over a long, polished dining table, set with fine silver and pristine white linen. My family was gathered at the far end of the room. Cameron was standing with a glass of vintage champagne raised high in the air. Harrison was leaning back in his chair with a cigar unlit in his fingers. Beatrice was adjusting the diamond necklace resting against her chest, her face arranged in a perfect, welcoming high society smile. The moment the doors parted, their eyes snapped toward the entrance. They were expecting an older, distinguished billionaire. They were expecting a stranger to walk through the doors and validate their entire existence. Cameron stepped forward, his chest puffed out, an eager, greedy smile stretching across his face. He extended his right hand, ready to greet his corporate savior. "Welcome to Austin," he began, his voice dripping with forced charisma. "On behalf of Vanguard Logistics, it is an absolute honor to—" The words died in his throat. The sound was choked off instantly, as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. His outstretched hand froze mid-air. The smug, visionary smile shattered into a million pieces, replaced by an expression of absolute, paralyzing horror. The color drained from his face so quickly he looked like a corpse. His eyes widened, fixing on my face, traveling down to my custom designer suit, and then taking in the formidable, expensive presence of the legal team flanking me. Beatrice let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor, shattering into sharp, glittering shards. The champagne splashed across her expensive designer shoes, but she did not even look down. She was staring at me as if I were a ghost that had crawled out of a grave. Harrison dropped his cigar. It rolled across the pristine white tablecloth. He gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning completely white. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words that refused to come. I did not stop walking. I moved into the room with slow, deliberate, measured steps, my heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of my approach. I commanded the space effortlessly, projecting an aura of power that completely dwarfed their fragile suburban arrogance. I walked past the shattered glass, past my frozen mother, and approached the head of the table. Cameron was still standing there, his arm awkwardly suspended in the air, his brain entirely unable to process the reality standing right in front of him. He looked at Felix, then at the attorneys, and finally back at me. His eyes were wide with a desperate, frantic denial. Tessa Cameron finally stammered, his voice cracking high and thin. "What are you doing here? How did you get past security? You cannot be in here. This is a private corporate meeting." Harrison finally found his voice, though it lacked any of the booming authority he usually commanded. He pushed himself out of his chair, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Get out," he demanded, trying to summon his usual rage but failing miserably. "I do not know what kind of sick joke you think this is, but you are going to ruin the most important night of your brother's life. If you do not leave this room immediately, I am calling the police." Beatrice pressed her hand to her chest, her breathing shallow and rapid. "You vindictive, jealous girl. You followed us here just to embarrass us in front of the CEO. Security. Someone call security right now. Security." I ignored their panicked, frantic sputtering. I reached the head of the table, the seat of honor that had been meticulously prepared for the anonymous billionaire. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down, crossing my legs smoothly. I rested my arms on the table, folding my hands together, and looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. When you wield absolute power, you can afford to speak softly. You can call security if you like, Dad. I said, the words echoing through the deadly silent room. But I own this restaurant. They work for me. In fact, everyone in this room works for me. I gestured slightly to my left. Felix stepped forward, his expression carved from stone. He placed a sleek black leather folder directly onto the table, sliding it precisely into the center. The embossed logo of Apex Holdings gleamed under the light of the crystal chandelier. Cameron stared at this folder, a low, panicked whimper escaping his throat. His eyes darted frantically around the room, the terrifying truth finally clawing its way through his thick skull. I leaned forward, the ambient light catching the sharp, decisive angles of my suit. "I am not crashing your private meeting, Cameron," I said, holding his gaze until he looked away, unable to bear the weight of my stare. "I am the one who invited you. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings. And as of 3:15 on Tuesday afternoon, I own Vanguard Logistics. Every truck, every contract, every single piece of broken software, it all belongs to me." The golden child stumbled backward, his knees hitting his chair. He collapsed into the seat, his mouth hanging open in silent devastation. The echo chamber had collapsed. The grand, arrogant facade of my family had been completely vaporized. They were trapped in a room with the daughter they had thrown into the freezing rain, and she was holding the deed to their entire lives. Harrison was the first to attempt to break the paralyzing silence that had completely consumed the room. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket with a violently shaking hand. He pulled out a silk handkerchief and dabbed at the heavy beads of cold sweat that had suddenly materialized across his forehead. He tried to force a laugh, hoping to project his usual booming authority, but the sound that escaped his throat was a dry, hollow wheeze. It was the sound of a man who realized he was no longer the apex predator in the room. Tessa Harrison said, his voice trembling as he tried to regain control of the situation. "I do not know how you managed to get past the security downstairs. I do not know whose clothes you borrowed, or how you convinced these people to help you pull this pathetic little stunt. But this is not a joke. You are crashing a highly classified private corporate dinner. We are waiting for the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings to arrive at any moment. You need to leave right now before you ruin this family for good. You useless failure." He took a threatening step forward, raising his hand as if he intended to physically grab my arm and drag me out of the dining room. He never made it that far. Felix immediately stepped into his path, smoothly blocking my father with the effortless, intimidating grace of a man who dealt with hostile executives for a living. One of my corporate attorneys also shifted forward, resting a hand inside his suit jacket. Harrison stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting between the highly paid professionals protecting me. He slowly lowered his hand and stepped back, his chest heaving with exertion and rising panic. I did not blink. I did not flinch at the familiar insult. The words that used to cut me to the bone now felt as harmless as a slight breeze passing through an open window. Felix stepped up to my left side and calmly opened his sleek leather briefcase. He extracted a crisp, freshly printed stack of legal papers and placed them directly in front of me. "I am not crashing your dinner, Dad," I said, my voice resonating with cold, absolute authority. I pressed my fingertips against the edge of the stack of papers and pushed. The document slid across the polished mahogany wood, stopping precisely in front of Harrison. "I am paying the bill," I told him. Harrison looked down at the document. His eyes scanned the bold print at the very top of the page. It was the final acquisition contract for Vanguard Logistics. He looked at the bottom of the page, where his own digital signature and Cameron's messy scrawl were permanently affixed next to the corporate seal of Apex Holdings. Then his eyes moved slowly, painfully, to the signature line belonging to the acquiring party. My signature was perfectly printed in stark black ink right above the title of Chief Executive Officer. "For the last 5 years, you all believed I was a bankrupt failure," I said, keeping my gaze locked on my father as his entire reality crumbled. "You believed I was destitute, living off scraps and completely useless to your precious family legacy. You threw me out into a freezing rainstorm because you thought I had absolutely nothing to offer you. The truth is, while you were busy coddling Cameron and funding his endless mistakes, I was building an empire. Apex Holdings is my company. I built it from nothing. It generates $15 million a year in pure revenue. I am the anonymous billionaire you have been desperately begging to save you all week. Beatrice let out a soft, strangled gasp, clutching the edge of the table as if the floor was dropping out from under her. Her eyes were wide, darting wildly between my expensive designer suit, my high-end watch, and the legal team standing at attention behind me. She worshipped wealth and status above all else, and the sheer reality of my empire, a wealth that entirely eclipsed their own suburban fortune, was actively breaking her brain. She looked like she might physically collapse under the weight of her own sudden realization. Cameron sat frozen in his chair, his face entirely devoid of color. He looked from me to the contract, and then back to me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. They had built their entire identities on the belief that they were inherently superior to me. Now the undeniable truth was sitting at the head of the table holding the financial leash to their future. But we are not here to talk about my success. I continued gesturing to one of the corporate attorneys standing behind me. The attorney stepped forward and handed me a thick, heavy black folder. I held it in my hands for a brief moment, feeling the absolute weight of their impending destruction. We are here to talk about your failures. I slid the black folder down the length of the table. It moved with a heavy, ominous sliding sound. It came to a stop directly in front of Cameron. Go ahead, Cameron, I instructed softly, my tone completely merciless. Open it. Cameron's hands were shaking violently. He reached out with trembling, sweaty fingers and flipped open the heavy black cover. The very first page was a printed copy of a wire transfer receipt from an offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands. The second page was a fabricated invoice from a ghost vendor that did not actually exist. The third page was an internal email from Vanguard Logistics detailing massive fuel expenditures for trucking routes that had never been driven. When you pitched Vanguard Logistics to my acquisitions team, you claimed you were experiencing minor operational hiccups, I said, leaning back in my chair and observing his absolute paralyzing panic. You claimed your infrastructure was just struggling to keep up with your massive market share. But you were lying. You were lying to me, you were lying to your primary investors, and you were lying to yourselves. I watched as Cameron frantically flipped through the pages, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. Every single piece of undeniable evidence of his massive embezzlement scheme was meticulously cataloged and highlighted in the folder. My forensic accounting team had missed absolutely nothing. The audit was a perfect, inescapable map of his crimes. You are not a corporate legend, Cameron, I told him, my voice slicing through the quiet dining room like a scalpel. You are a common thief. You have been funneling investor capital into dummy corporations for the last 8 months. You have been creating fake invoices for logistics services that were never rendered. You have been actively robbing your own venture capital partners blind to pay for your luxury cars, your country club fees, and your expensive suits. And you actually thought you could use my $30 million buyout to quietly replace the stolen funds before the federal auditors noticed the missing money. Cameron dropped the folder. He covered his face with his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic, broken sob. The reality of his exposure was entirely too much for his fragile, pampered ego to handle. Harrison's face had gone from pale to a sickly mottled gray. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He sank heavily into his chair, his shoulders completely slumped. I turned my attention fully onto him, refusing to let him look away. And you, Dad, I said, leaning forward once again. You are just as guilty. We found the encrypted emails. We found the message threads where you actively advised Cameron on how to structure the ghost vendor payouts to avoid triggering an internal audit. You helped him falsify the revenue projections. You actively conspired to hide the financial rot because you could not bear the thought of your golden child failing in public. You risked everything to protect a lie. Beatrice looked at Harrison in absolute shock, clearly unaware of the depth of her husband's involvement in the corporate fraud. Harrison, what is she talking about? Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not do this. Harrison did not answer her. He could not. He just stared at the black folder sitting in front of Cameron, as if it were a live bomb that had already detonated. You both rushed to sign the acquisition contract this afternoon. I continued making sure every single word landed with devastating precision. You were so blinded by your own arrogance, your own greed, and your desperate need to cover up your crimes that you completely ignored the warnings of your own legal team. You signed the ironclad liability clause on page 47 without a single modification. I looked at my brother, who was now weeping openly at the table, and then at my father, who looked like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the floor to drop. By signing that contract, you explicitly assumed absolute personal, financial, and criminal liability for any hidden financial discrepancies discovered after the sale. You waived all corporate protections. My company now owns the clean assets of Vanguard Logistics, but you too personally own the multi-million-dollar embezzlement fraud. I did not buy your company to save you. I bought it to ensure you face the absolute maximum federal penalty for your crimes. The absolute silence in the Regent room was suffocating. The air felt heavy, thick with the undeniable reality of their complete destruction. Cameron stared at the black folder on the table as if a venomous snake was coiled inside it. He was hyperventilating, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow jerks. Harrison remained frozen in his chair, the gray pallor of his skin deepening into a sickly white. They had heard my words, but their arrogant minds were violently rejecting the concept of consequence. They had never faced a consequence in their entire lives. I did not give them a single second to catch their breath. I leaned back into the luxurious leather chair at the head of the table and folded my hands. I told you I did not buy your company to save it, I said, my voice echoing off the dark mahogany walls. I bought it to liquidate it completely. Every single physical asset Vanguard Logistics currently possesses is already being seized by my corporate restructuring team. Your fleet of delivery trucks, your warehouse leases, your client lists, your operational hardware, even the ergonomic chairs in your executive suites. It all belongs to Apex Holdings now. We are stripping the company down to the studs. By tomorrow morning, Vanguard Logistics will be nothing but an empty shell, a hollowed-out corporate corpse. Cameron finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, wet sound. "You cannot do that," he stammered, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "You cannot just liquidate my company. We have employees. We have contracts. I just bought a brand new sports car on credit based on this buyout. You are my sister. You are supposed to help me. You are supposed to fix this." "I am a chief executive officer," I corrected him coldly. "And as a chief executive officer, I recognize a toxic asset when I see one. You ran that company into the ground with your profound incompetence, and then you tried to cover your tracks by stealing from the very people who trusted you. I am not helping you, Cameron. I am taking the only things of value you had left and leaving you to answer for the rot you created. You will be walking out of this restaurant with nothing but the clothes on your back and a mountain of unpayable debt." Felix stepped forward, his presence towering and absolute. He looked down at my brother and my father with the detached clinical expression of a surgeon examining a terminal patient. "Per the ironclad liability clause you both willingly signed this afternoon," Felix explained smoothly, "Apex Holdings is legally insulated from all historical financial irregularities. We assume the clean physical assets, but you retain absolute personal and criminal liability for the missing investor capital. The embezzlement scheme is entirely your burden. And because we are a publicly accountable entity, our legal team is obligated to report the discovery of this massive fraud to the appropriate federal authorities." Harrison let out a choked, desperate sound. He grabbed his chest, his breathing ragged. "You are turning us in," my father gasped, his eyes wide with sheer terror. "You are handing your own brother and your father over to the federal government. You are sending us to prison. You are destroying our entire lives over a business misunderstanding." "You sent yourselves to prison," I replied without a shred of sympathy. "You chose to commit fraud. You chose to embezzle millions of dollars to fund country club memberships and luxury cars. You chose to sign a binding legal document without reading the fine print because you were blinded by your own unchecked greed. I did not force you to steal, Dad. I just turned on the lights so everyone else could see what you were doing in the dark." The unified front of my family, the impenetrable fortress of suburban superiority they had maintained for decades, shattered completely. the illusion of their invincibility, was vaporized in an instant. The crushing weight of impending federal indictments, total bankruptcy, and public humiliation crashed down on them all at once. That was when Beatrice broke. My mother had been sitting frozen since I walked through the heavy wooden doors, her mind completely short-circuiting as she tried to reconcile the image of her useless bankrupt daughter with the reality of the multi-million-dollar corporate titan sitting at the head of the table. The cognitive dissonance was too much for her fragile status-obsessed ego to handle. She looked at the expensive designer suit I was wearing. She looked at the diamond watch on my wrist. She looked at the team of ruthless, highly paid attorneys standing at my command. She realized in that exact moment that she had violently thrown unimaginable wealth out into the freezing rain. Beatrice let out a sudden, piercing sob. The sound was jarring, completely devoid of her usual refined, high society grace. She pushed her chair back, ignoring the shattered crystal champagne flute near her expensive shoes, and scrambled toward my end of the table. Tessa, Beatrice cried, her voice pitching into a frantic, desperate whine. Tessa, please, you have to listen to me. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. You cannot do this to us. Think of our friends. Think of the country club. We will be ruined. We will be outcasts. She reached out her manicured hands, trembling violently as she tried to grab my arm. I did not flinch, but Felix instantly stepped between us, his posture radiating a silent, undeniable threat. Beatrice stopped, shrinking back slightly, but her eyes remained locked on my face. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. We did not mean it. Beatrice pleaded, her voice cracking as she adopted a tone of frantic, groveling desperation. We never meant to hurt you, sweetheart. You have to believe me. When your father kicked you out on Friday night, it was not because we hated you. It was tough love. I stared at her, my expression completely flat. Tough love, I repeated, letting the absurdity of the phrase hang in the air. Yes, Beatrice nodded, aggressively desperate to spin a narrative that could save her from the abyss. We knew you were special, Tessa. We always knew you had this incredible potential locked inside you. We saw your brilliance, but you were so stubborn. We thought that if we pushed you, if we made things difficult for you, it would motivate you to finally succeed. We were just trying to give you the push you needed to become the brilliant woman sitting in front of us today. We did it for you. We did it because we loved you. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her manipulation was almost impressive. She was standing in a private dining room facing total financial annihilation, and she was genuinely attempting to take credit for the $15 million empire I had built entirely without her. She was trying to reframe a lifetime of emotional abuse, neglect, and outright cruelty as a masterclass in motivational parenting. You threw my belongings into the mud, I said quietly, the stillness in my voice cutting through her frantic sobbing. You told me I was a selfish disappointment. You stood on your beautiful staircase and sneered at me, while Cameron physically shoved me into a torrential storm. You told me to go live in the streets. You did not do that out of love, Mom. You did it because you thought I was poor and poverty is the only thing you truly despise. No, Beatrice wailed, clasping her hands together in a theatrical display of maternal agony. You are twisting my words. You know how much this family means to me. We are blood, Tessa. You cannot do this to your own blood. You have so much money now. You have everything you could ever want. You can fix this. You can drop the acquisition. You can pay back the investors for Cameron. $30 million is nothing to you now. You can save us. I looked at my mother, watching her abandon every single shred of her precious dignity. The woman who had dropped a $50 bill on my coffee shop table just a few hours ago, telling me to go buy a clean shirt so I would not embarrass her, was now openly begging for a multi-million-dollar handout. She did not care about the crimes her son and husband had committed. She did not care about the ethics or the legality of the situation. She only cared about preserving her country club membership and her pristine social image. She was perfectly willing to sacrifice my hard-earned empire to cover up their profound failures. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. I looked past Beatrice, making eye contact with Harrison, who was staring at the floor in absolute defeat, and then at Cameron, who was still quietly sobbing into his hands. I am not saving you. I told them, my voice echoing with finality. I am not paying your debts. I am not covering up your crimes. I am not protecting your precious legacy. For my entire life, you demanded that I earn my place in this family. You demanded that I prove my worth. Well, I proved it. I built a mountain of success with my bare hands while you were busy digging yourselves a bottomless grave. Beatrice fell to her knees right there on the plush carpet of the Regent Room. The ultimate high society matriarch was kneeling on the floor, weeping uncontrollably, her designer gown pooling around her. "Tessa, please," she begged, her voice echoing shrilly off the walls. "You are my daughter. You are my little girl. You cannot destroy us." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no lingering attachment to the woman who had made my life a living hell. The emotional tether had been completely severed. I did not wait for her response. I stood up from the luxurious leather chair, adjusting the cuffs of my suit. The execution was complete. The illusion was shattered. The family that had treated me like garbage was now left with absolutely nothing but the overwhelming, inescapable reality of their own ruin. I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, my legal team falling into step right behind me. My hand had barely brushed the brass handle of the heavy mahogany door when a sudden violent crash echoed through the dining room behind me. It was not the delicate sound of shattering crystal this time. It was the heavy, brutal thud of a wooden dining chair being violently overturned. I stopped and slowly turned around. Felix and the corporate attorneys paused beside me, standing in absolute silence as we watched the final, inevitable collapse of my family. Harrison had lunged across the pristine white tablecloth. The dignified, untouchable patriarch I had feared my entire life was entirely gone. In his place was a red-faced, sweating, desperate man facing the absolute certainty of federal prison. He grabbed Cameron by the lapels of his custom-tailored navy suit, hoisting him half out of his seat. "You told me the books were clean!" Harrison roared, his voice cracking with sheer panic, completely abandoning any pretense of high society restraint. "You looked me right in the eye in my own study and swore on this family name that those ghost vendors were completely untraceable. You said you had the offshore accounts perfectly insulated." Cameron clawed frantically at our father's hands. "Get off of me!" he shrieked, his voice pitching high with terror. He shoved Harrison backward with surprising force. Harrison stumbled, his hip colliding with the table, knocking over a heavy silver candelabra that clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. "I did exactly what you taught me to do!" Cameron screamed back. His face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure rage. "You are the one who told me to inflate the revenue projections. You are the one who said the venture capital investors would never look closely at the third-party payouts if we just kept promising them a massive return. You co-signed the fraudulent loans because you wanted the cash injection just as badly as I did. I gave you a golden ticket." Harrison bellowed, his chest heaving as he pointed a shaking finger at his golden boy. "I bought that logistics company for you. I funded your entire life. I gave you every single advantage a man could ask for, and you squandered all of it. You used my signature to commit federal fraud because you are too stupid to run a legitimate business. You ruined me. You ruined yourself." Cameron spat back, pacing like a caged animal. "You wanted a prodigy. You wanted a visionary son you could walk into the country club and brag about to all your wealthy friends. Do you have any idea how much money it takes to pretend we belong in that upper echelon? You pushed me to scale the company too fast. You told me to fake it until I made it. I was just trying to maintain the lifestyle you demanded from me." I stood by the doors and watched them tear each other to absolute shreds. This was the family that had demanded perfection from me. This was the family that had called me a useless failure because I did not fit into their pristine, flawless narrative. Now the curtain had been pulled back, and the ugly, rotting truth was fully exposed. They were behaving like cornered rats, viciously turning on one another the exact second their survival was threatened. The unwavering loyalty they had always claimed to possess was nothing but a transactional arrangement. They only loved each other as long as the money was flowing. Beatrice scrambled up from the floor, her designer gown stained with spilled champagne and her perfect makeup ruined by her frantic tears. She threw herself between her husband and her golden child, desperately trying to physically separate them. "Stop it! Both of you, stop it right now!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the dark wood-paneled walls. "People will hear you. The waitstaff are right outside those doors. You are making a scene. Even now facing the total annihilation of their wealth and impending federal indictments, her primary concern was that the restaurant employees might hear them arguing. Her obsession with their social image overrode her basic survival instincts. Cameron turned his furious bloodshot eyes onto our mother. "Shut up, Mom!" he yelled, completely shattering the illusion of the respectful, devoted son. "This is your fault too. Do not pretend you are innocent in this. You demanded the luxury vacations to Bali. You demanded the new cars and the designer clothes. You spent the embezzled money just as fast as I stole it. You happily took the cash I funneled into your accounts, and now you want to pretend you did not know where it was coming from." Beatrice recoiled as if she had been physically struck. She gasped, pressing her hand over her mouth. Her perfect son, the child she had worshipped and actively weaponized against me for my entire life, had just thrown her directly under the bus to save his own skin. The betrayal in her eyes was profound, but I felt no sympathy for her. She had built this monster and now it was turning around to devour her. "Cameron, how could you say such a thing to me?" Beatrice sobbed, looking frantically between her husband and her son. "We did everything for you. We sacrificed everything for you. You sacrificed Tessa." Cameron sneered, pointing a finger directly at me where I stood by the door. "You threw her out into the street because you needed to feel superior. And look where that got us. She is the billionaire and we are the ones going to jail." I watched the meltdown with a deep clinical detachment. A profound realization washed over me in that moment. My entire life I had believed that being the scapegoat of this family was a curse. I had cried myself to sleep wondering why I was never good enough to be loved the way they loved Cameron. But looking at the wreckage in front of me, I finally understood the truth. My exclusion was not a curse. It was my absolute greatest protection. If they had loved me, if they had welcomed me into their inner circle, they would have dragged me down into their criminal enterprise. They would have used me to sign fraudulent loans and hide their embezzled funds. Being discarded by them had forced me to build my own independent, clean empire. Their cruelty had literally saved my life. I stepped away from the heavy mahogany doors and walked slowly back toward the center of the room. The sheer volume of their screaming died down as I approached. They fell silent, panting and sweating, their aristocratic masks completely obliterated. They looked at me with a mixture of terror and desperate misplaced hope, wondering if my return meant I was somehow going to intervene and save them from each other. I stopped at the table. The crisp $50 bill that Beatrice had dropped on my coffee shop table earlier that day was still resting on the pristine white tablecloth where I had placed it. It was a pathetic, wrinkled piece of paper that represented the absolute totality of their arrogance. I picked up the $50 bill. I held it between my fingers, letting them stare at it. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I slid the bill back across the mahogany wood. It stopped right in front of Beatrice's trembling hands. I looked into my mother's terrified eyes, then shifted my gaze to my father, and finally to my trembling, broken brother. My voice was ice-cold and completely untouchable. "You told me to go live in the streets," I said, the absolute certainty of my victory ringing through the quiet dining room. "I bought the street instead. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the corporate offices before I change the locks." I did not wait for another word. I turned on my heel and walked out of the Regent Room, leaving the heavy mahogany doors wide open behind me. The execution was entirely complete, and I was finally permanently free. The cool night air of the Austin Financial District hit my face the moment I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the restaurant. Felix and my legal team walked silently beside me. We did not speak about the absolute devastation we had just left behind in the private dining room. There was no need to celebrate or gloat over the wreckage. The execution was a matter of pure corporate precision. I climbed into the waiting Maybach, sinking into the plush leather seat, and watched the vibrant city lights blur past the tinted windows. I had given my family exactly 48 hours to vacate the corporate premises of Vanguard Logistics. They did not even make it that long. By early Saturday morning, my corporate restructuring team had completely locked down their headquarters. When Cameron drove his newly financed luxury sports car to the office building on Sunday afternoon, desperately hoping to salvage some of his personal files, or perhaps shred the remaining physical evidence. His keycard glowed red and emitted a harsh, denying beep. Two of my private security contractors met him at the pristine glass entrance. They handed him a small, cheap cardboard box containing his desk photographs and informed him that he was officially trespassing on property owned entirely by Apex Holdings. Cameron threw a massive screaming tantrum in the parking lot demanding to speak to his father, but my security personnel simply stood like stone statues until he finally gave up and drove away in absolute defeat. That was the very last time he ever set foot on corporate property. 5 weeks passed. They were the most brutally efficient 5 weeks in the history of my company. My team moved with absolute merciless speed. We completely liquidated Vanguard Logistics from top to bottom. Every single physical asset was seized, meticulously cataloged, and absorbed into the Apex Holdings infrastructure. We absorbed their massive warehouse leases, integrated their viable client lists into our own superior routing systems, and auctioned off their vast fleet of delivery trucks to the highest bidders. The physical servers that once held Cameron's stolen data were wiped completely clean and reprogrammed to support my own global network. Every shred of his supposed genius was overwritten by my code. The company Cameron had proudly paraded around the country club as a legendary empire was entirely vaporized. It ceased to exist on paper and in reality. But the corporate liquidation was only the beginning of their living nightmare. The financial execution required federal involvement. On the first Monday of the 5th week, Felix walked into the regional headquarters of the White Collar Crime Division. He moved past the security desks and asked for the lead investigator. He carried the heavy black folder containing every single piece of undeniable evidence my forensic auditors had compiled. He handed over the fabricated invoices, the detailed records of the offshore bank transfers in the Cayman Islands, and the printed copies of the encrypted emails where Harrison actively instructed Cameron on how to hide the embezzled venture capital. Because Cameron and Harrison had willingly and eagerly signed the ironclad liability clause during the acquisition, Apex Holdings was completely shielded from the fallout. The federal agents did not even need to look in our direction. We were just the innocent buyers who discovered a crime. The agents focused their absolute devastating attention directly on my father and my brother. Over the following several months, federal investigators followed every transaction. Then the indictments came. Warrants were issued for both Cameron and Harrison on multiple counts of severe financial fraud, grand investor embezzlement, and corporate conspiracy. I was sitting in my downtown penthouse when the breaking news flashed across the local business channels. The helicopter camera footage showed federal agents walking into my parents' pristine suburban home early in the morning. They led Harrison out the front door in heavy steel handcuffs. His expensive tailored suit was deeply wrinkled, his hair was an unkempt mess, and his head was bowed in absolute crushing humiliation. He looked small and utterly defeated as the agents pushed him into the back of a dark government vehicle. Cameron was arrested at a cheap, rundown motel on the far outskirts of the city. He had fled there when his new black sports car was abruptly repossessed by the dealership due to massive missed payments and frozen bank accounts. The golden child looked completely unrecognizable on the television screen. He was pale, disheveled, and weeping openly as they placed him into custody. His bail was set at an astronomical figure that the family could no longer even dream of affording. The boy who had spent his entire life sleeping on high-thread count silk sheets was now forced to sleep on a thin, uncomfortable mattress in a crowded federal holding cell, waiting endlessly for a trial he was guaranteed to lose. The reality of federal prison was closing in on him, stripping away the last remaining fragments of his unearned confidence. The venture capital investors. They had systematically filed massive civil lawsuits immediately following the criminal indictments, facing astronomical legal fees and the aggressive demand for total financial restitution. Cameron and Harrison had absolutely no choice. They declared total unmitigated bankruptcy. Their bank accounts were instantly frozen. Their lucrative investment portfolios were seized. Every single dollar they had hoarded, every cent they had stolen to prop up their arrogant facade, was stripped away by the federal government to pay back the people they had so brazenly defrauded. They were completely ruined. But the most devastating blow of the entire 5-week ordeal was reserved specifically for my mother. Beatrice had always believed she was entirely immune to the consequences of her husband's and her son's reckless actions. She believed her lofty social status and her pristine public image would somehow magically protect her from the financial slaughter happening around her. She was entirely wrong. During the peak of Vanguard Logistics' cash flow crisis, months before they had desperately pitched the buyout to my anonymous company, Harrison had needed quick capital to keep their grand illusion alive. He had secretly gone to the bank and taken out a massive high-interest loan to cover the mounting operational debts and keep Cameron out of trouble. To secure that massive loan, he had used their pristine suburban mansion as the primary collateral. Beatrice had absolutely no idea that the massive house she prized above all else, the sprawling fortress of her social superiority, was legally tied to her son's failing corporate venture. When Harrison declared bankruptcy and the federal government seized his remaining liquid assets, the bank immediately triggered the collateral clause. The foreclosure process was swift, brutal, and entirely public. I watched from a distance as the bank sent eviction agents to the property on a Tuesday morning. Beatrice was forcibly removed from the home she had proudly reigned over for decades. The bank did not just take the house, they seized all the valuable contents inside it to cover the remaining debt. Beatrice was forced to watch as indifferent auctioneers carried out her priceless antique furniture, her imported crystal chandeliers, and the expensive designer clothing she had flaunted for years. She stood on the very same covered porch where she had sneered at me in the freezing rain, watching complete strangers change the locks on her heavy wooden doors. The luxury sport utility vehicles were towed away one by one. Every material object she had used to define her worth was auctioned off to strangers for pennies on the dollar. The imported Italian marble foyer where my father had hurled my duffel bag into the mud was now the permanent property of the local bank. Beatrice frantically pulled out her phone, dialing the numbers of all her wealthy socialite friends, desperately begging them for a place to stay or a temporary loan. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The country club immediately and publicly revoked their membership, citing the profound disgrace of the federal indictments and the massive civil lawsuits. The wealthy friends who had blindly praised Cameron on social media and eagerly attended my mother's extravagant dinner parties dropped them instantly. Their invitations vanished into thin air. They became absolute pariahs in the high society circles they had once dominated with such relentless arrogance. No one wanted to be associated with a family of convicted embezzlers, with absolutely no money, abysmal credit, and zero remaining assets. With Harrison still in federal custody, Beatrice was forced to move alone into a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a run-down, dangerous neighborhood on the far edge of the city. The apartment smelled of cheap paint and old smoke, completely devoid of the luxury they had felt so entitled to. They were entirely exiled from their previous world, living in a suffocatingly cramped space, completely consumed by the crushing poverty they had always so deeply despised. They had spent their entire lives mocking people who struggled to make ends meet, and now they were trapped in that exact same struggle, with no hope of ever climbing out. The pristine family legacy they had sacrificed me to protect was permanently destroyed, buried under a mountain of debt, federal charges, and profound social humiliation. 2 days after the bank finalized the foreclosure on the pristine suburban mansion, I received a delivery at the corporate headquarters of Apex Holdings. It arrived via standard postal mail, resting in a plain white envelope that looked incredibly cheap and entirely out of place on the polished glass of my executive desk. The return address, scrawled in the top corner, belonged to the rundown apartment complex on the far edge of the city where they had been forcibly relocated. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was the frantic, uneven cursive of my mother Beatrice. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before picking up a silver letter opener to slice it open. Inside was a multi-page handwritten letter. The heavy textured cardstock she used for her country club correspondence was completely gone, replaced by thin-lined notebook paper. It was a stark physical manifestation of their total financial collapse. I spread the pages across my desk and began to read the final desperate words of the people who had thrown me away. The letter was a masterpiece of desperate manipulation and breathtaking revisionist history. Beatrice dedicated the first 3 pages to painting herself and my father as the ultimate victims of circumstance. She claimed that they had been entirely blinded by Cameron and his endless lies. She wrote that Cameron had emotionally manipulated them into supporting Vanguard Logistics and that they had absolutely no idea the extent of his financial crimes until I so bravely brought them to light. It was a pathetic attempt to shift the absolute totality of the blame onto their golden child, abandoning him the exact second he ceased to be a source of pride and became a source of profound legal liability. They showed absolutely no loyalty to the son they had worshipped for 35 years, proving that their affection had always been a conditional performance. Then came the inevitable pivot. The tone of the letter shifted abruptly from victimhood to cloying, insincere flattery. Beatrice wrote that she and Harrison had spent the last few weeks reflecting deeply on their mistakes. She claimed they realized how incredibly harsh they had been to me 5 years ago, and how deeply they regretted losing those years with their brilliant, successful daughter. She wrote that they had always known I was destined for greatness, and that my $15 million empire was proof of the strong work ethic they had instilled in me. They were actively trying to take credit for the massive success I built out of the sheer trauma of their rejection. But the true purpose of the letter was buried in the very last paragraph. Stripped of their wealth, their social standing, and their comfortable suburban fortress, they were finally experiencing the exact same terror and desperate poverty I had felt when they threw me out into the freezing rain. Beatrice begged me for a second chance at being a family. She pleaded with me to remember the bond of blood and the obligations of a daughter. And then, hidden behind layers of emotional manipulation, she explicitly asked for a loan. She described their cramped, smelling apartment and complained endlessly about the noise from the street below. She asked for just enough capital to help them secure a respectable condominium and retain a halfway decent defense attorney for my father. She promised they would pay me back with interest the very second they got back on their feet. She ended the letter by saying she was waiting by the phone, hoping her beautiful daughter would find it in her heart to show mercy to her aging parents. I gathered the crinkled pages of the letter and walked out of my office. I took the private elevator up to my penthouse. I did not feel a single ounce of anger as I stepped out into my living space. The rage that had fueled me for the last 5 years had completely burned away, leaving behind nothing but a cool, clean clarity. I walked through the quiet luxury of my home and pushed open the heavy glass doors that led out to the expansive wraparound balcony. The warm Texas wind brushed against my face as I stepped out into the evening air. I stepped up to the edge of the glass railing and looked out over the sprawling, vibrant city of Austin. The skyline glittered with millions of lights, stretching out brightly as far as the eye could see. I had conquered this entire city alone. I stood there holding the desperate pleas of the people who had brought me into this world, and I realized something profound. For a very long time, I had believed that success was the ultimate revenge. I had believed that if I just made enough money, if I just built a big enough company, they would finally have to look at me and admit that I was worthy of their love. But looking at the pathetic scribbles on the cheap notebook paper, I understood that their love was completely worthless. Their affection was entirely transactional. They only loved people who could elevate their social status or pad their bank accounts. They did not want a daughter. They wanted a safety net to catch them when their own arrogance sent them plummeting off a cliff. They were incapable of genuine love. True wealth, I realized, was not the $15 million sitting in my corporate accounts. It was not the custom designer suits, the blacked-out Maybach, or the high-security penthouse. True wealth was the absolute impenetrable freedom of never having to seek validation from toxic people again. I did not need my parents to see my worth because I had finally learned to see it myself. I had survived the freezing rain. I had survived the bankruptcy, the hunger, and the endless nights of crushing self-doubt. I had built a massive fortress of my own making, and I held the only key. I did not owe them my mercy, and I certainly did not owe them a single dollar of my money. My obligation to them ended the exact second they locked that heavy wooden door behind me. A younger version of myself might have written back. She might have drafted a long, angry response detailing every single way they had failed her. She might have tried to make them understand the depth of the pain they caused. But I knew that explaining my pain to them would be like trying to describe colors to someone who refuses to open their eyes. They would never understand, because understanding would require them to take accountability, and accountability was a concept they were entirely incapable of grasping. I raised my hands and smoothly tore the stack of papers cleanly down the middle. The sound of the ripping paper was incredibly satisfying. I put the pieces together and tore them again and again until the frantic, desperate words of my mother were reduced to meaningless scraps of white paper. I did not throw them over the balcony. I was not going to litter my beautiful city with their toxicity. Instead, I turned around and walked back inside the penthouse. I dropped the shredded remnants of their apologies directly into the trash can by the door, exactly where they belonged. I did not save a single piece for posterity. I did not shed a single tear for the family I had lost. The emotional execution was officially complete. I walked back out to the balcony, taking one deep, calming breath of the fresh night air. The city below was vibrant and alive, pulsing with the energy of a million different futures. I belonged to that bright future now. The painful past was a closed chapter, a brutal lesson learned through fire and sealed with absolute ice. Felix was sitting at the kitchen island, running his finger across the screen of his tablet. He had let himself in using his secure access code. He looked up as I entered the room, his sharp eyes catching the subtle shift in my demeanor. He did not ask about the letter. He did not need to. We operated on a frequency of absolute mutual understanding. "We have a new situation to review," Felix said, his voice returning to the crisp, professional rhythm that built our empire. A tech manufacturing firm out of Silicon Valley just submitted a pitch for a Series B funding round. They have a brilliant hardware prototype, but their operational supply chain is a complete disaster. They are hemorrhaging capital on inefficient shipping routes, and they need our algorithm to stabilize their global distribution. The valuation is aggressive, but the potential return on investment is massive. I walked over to the kitchen island and poured myself a glass of cold water. I took a slow, feeling the cool liquid wash away the last lingering remnants of the evening. I set the glass down and looked at my business partner, the man who had stood beside me when I had absolutely nothing and helped me build everything. "Send me the pitch deck," I said, my voice ringing with total absolute certainty. "Let us see exactly what they are offering." I pulled out one of the heavy leather bar stools and sat down next to him, leaning over to look at the digital files illuminated on his screen. The numbers glowed brightly, detailing a completely new puzzle waiting to be solved. A new company to optimize, a new challenge to conquer. I focused my mind entirely on the data in front of me, leaving the ruined legacy of Harrison, Beatrice, and Cameron completely behind in the darkness. I had closed the door on my past forever, and the future was looking incredibly bright.